Hello, welcome to Bogan Intel. Today we're joined by Ahmed Alabadla, a Palestinian activist with a powerful insight on Gaza, the place he was born and raised. And he provides knowledge of the impact of the occupation, the ongoing struggle for Palestinian liberation, and paints a picture from the vibrant streets of pre-October 7 Gaza before its destruction to the complexities of the Palestinian resistance and the devastating cost of the genocide. Ahmed unpacks the realities on the ground, but will also explore Israel's internal turmoil, the role of global powers like the US, and whether movements like BDS and international recognition of Palestine signal hope for justice, or are they just more words where actions are needed in their place? With no further ado, let's get to Ahmed. Thank you very much for joining the program, Ahmed Alabadla.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks for having me.
Now, it's just an honor to have you on the program, and people might know you through your activism as a Palestinian man living in Australia. And I was just wondering if you could give us a little bit of information, firstly, on who you are, where you come from, and how it was growing up in Palestine.
Absolutely. And really, thank you, Joel, for inviting me to this interview. It's a pleasure and honor to be on your platform. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that I'm meeting on that I'm dialing in from an unstolen land of Camaragal. Well, my name is Ahmed. I am Palestinian from Gaza. I've been in this country for about 16 years. I migrated here like everybody else for opportunity, trying to change the passport, the travel document that I have, which had been nothing but an accusation. As a Palestinian, you'll be oppressed and harassed everywhere in the world, even in the Arab world. And so that probably gives you a glimpse of the reality of Palestinians with Palestinian passport, especially those from Gaza. I always say Gaza has always been the crucible of resistance, and that's why it's been hated so much in the Israeli psyche. But I guess we'll delve deeper into that later on. But growing up in Gaza as opposed to the Western society is very, very, very different. Even growing up in Gaza or the West Bank as a Palestinian is very different from growing up in other Arab countries like Egypt or Jordan. It's that unique experience as a Palestinian living under siege for as long as Gaza existed, really. I mean, Gaza was designed to actually function, Gaza Strip, to function as a concentration camp for Palestinian refugees ever since the Nakba, 1948. And that feeds into the fact that, more than 80% of the population in Gaza are actually refugees seeking the return to their homeland in Palestine. And this is another thing why maybe I'm jumping the gun here, so to speak, but this is why we see a systematic destruction of refugee camps inside the Gaza Strip, because there's an attempt and a systematic attempt to erase that question of Palestinian refugees and the question of return, which is a right entrenched internationally under the United Nations. And so growing up in Gaza, I grew up in the atmosphere of the first Intifada, 1987. I was 2 years when it ignited in December 1987. That's when the Islamic resistance movement was established, and it was jolted into action, resisting the occupation. So that really heated, inflamed atmosphere kind of instilled in that generation that sense of urgency and the urgency of resistance, and instilled the concept of resistance in that generation. And even after Oslo 1993, the occupation persisted in so many different ways. As Neve Gordon, the Israeli scholar who's now based in England, describes the mechanics of that occupation and how we ended up going through Oslo Accord as he described it, the first Intifada was so intense that Oslo Accord was as a way out, an exit route for the Israelis to get rid of the resistance, and it was quickly co-opted by the external leadership of the PLO. I would go insofar as describing it as a moment similar to what we are going through right now, the first Intifada. It was so intense that the Israelis resorted to sitting down with the Palestinians, negotiating. Of course, we ended up having a subcontractor to the occupation, and we ended up where we are now. But I fear, the recent recognition of Palestine and two-state solution, I fear that, we are going through a similar moment, and that's why we really need to resist it as hard as we can.
It's incredible that you say, about the makeup of Gaza itself. And it seems like, the way you put it, it's kind of like a living memory of the Nakba for the Israelis there, but they want to eradicate. There's just evidence and witnesses everywhere, and they have like keys to the doors of the Israeli state. And I've never heard it sort of put like that before. And you're a local Gaza local though. Your family has generations in Gaza before the Nakba.
Yeah, I so happen to be in amongst the minority of the population in Gaza. I'm from the 20% local Gazans who was born and raised in generations in Khan Yunis, in the southern part of Gaza Strip.
And how does this like incredibly vibrant and diverse society how does it how does it operate under the occupation? I just saw harken back to footage before October 6, and there was all this kind of talk in the Western press via Israel about Gaza could have been the Singapore of the Middle East, and blah 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 blah, and it could have made flowers bloom. But really, from what I can see, it was quite a vibrant city, considering it was a walled off. It was doing the best that it could, considering the circumstances. And potentially, the whole concept of a Singapore of the Middle East was actually gleaned out of looking at Gaza itself, and actually how it was operating despite what was happening around it. So, how did everyday life, how does everyday society, run under this occupation in Gaza? How did it before October 7?
Well, I mean, how far into the occupation can we go? I mean, like I said, the whole strip was designed to be isolated from the remaining parts of Palestine. Ever since the late 80s, I would say 1967 as well. Um, Life in Gaza, I mean, I'm gonna start where I was born, for example, 1985. Like I said, I was born around the first Intifada, and witnessing tanks roaming the streets, recurring home invasions by Israeli army, the arresting, the harassment, the oppression, the checkpoints, you name it, leading up all to the 1993 Oslo. We had some sort of limited controlled freedom. We had, an airport at some point. We were able to fly in and out, but also that system of approvals that was still imposed and implemented. So no one can leave or get in unless they're approved by the occupation. Back then, before I finished high school in 2002 and 3, and then I left. I did my undergraduate degree in Jordan. And then in 2005, there was this unilateral disengagement where all the settlers from the Gaza Strip were withdrawn by Sharon. He was the prime minister back then. And beyond that, they retreated. And then they, after that, claimed that Gaza is not occupied, but everyone knows under the international law, Gaza remained occupied and besieged. And following Hamas's landslide win in the Palestinian legislation, Gaza Strip was put under sanctions. The population in Gaza was put under an extreme diet, as Neve Gordon and other scholars describe it. They prohibited some goods from getting in. Certain types of chocolates were not allowed in, certain types of fruit. So I had firsthand exposure of that. And growing up in Gaza at that point and going through high school as a Gazan youth, and I probably speak on behalf of many Gazans back then, I couldn't wait until I graduated from high school to be able to leave. So that was like a dream for every Gazan youth back then, to be able to leave and pursue life, because we knew that there's a life outside Gaza, because we also understood that life in Gaza is not what it should be. Huge limitation in terms of if you have an illness, or if you would like to go and visit your siblings or families overseas in Arab countries, if you would like to pursue higher education and come back and visit your family. Back then, I went to Jordan to do my undergraduate degree in 2003, and was not able to come back until I finished in 2007. And then, even then, the siege and the blockade was at its height. So I ended up actually staying abroad. I wasn't able to come back and visit my family until 2013. That's when I got my Australian citizenship. So 10 years after I left, I was finally able to come back and visit my family in 2013. And then beyond that, also the siege persisted, the blockade persisted. And another 10 years later, I was able to come back and visit my family just before the genocide started, 2023. And so freedom of movement, not everybody takes it for granted. You'll be able to, have 2 weeks off from your work and go visit your family if you live in Jordan, or I don't know, Egypt. So that's possible, but for a Palestinian in Gaza, it's not possible. And I had to actually quit my job in 2013 to be able to kind of, that's it. I need to see my family. I need to be back. And that's what happened. So all these little things that everyone take for granted, for example, if you have electricity ongoing, you can't imagine yourself living one day without having a fridge for a couple of hours operating. In Gaza, that doesn't exist. In Gaza, you're only allowed electricity for 4 or 5. If you're lucky, you get 6 hours of electricity. The things about Gazans, I don't want to fetishize them as heroes or superhuman, but they find a way to adapt over the past almost 18 years now under siege. They found a way to kind of thrive, although the unemployment levels were soaring, reaching 45-46% in 2023 before the genocide. The level of the economic embargo imposed on the government, they managed to, cultivate an academic life, a social life, an economic life, despite the occupation. So life was thriving in Gaza in its own way. I don't want to imagine it as a Singapore, like you mentioned, of the world, but it could have been if it wasn't for the systematic de-development of the Palestinian economy inside Gaza. Ever since 2005, the unilateral disengagement, and really a lead scholar on this. I encourage everyone who's listening to read her book, Sarah Roy. She's a really great authority on Gaza in the 80s, 90s. She wrote multiple books about Hamas, about Gaza, and she describes how that systematic, sustainable de-development of the Palestinian life inside of Gaza, intentional, of course, by the Israeli occupation.
They talk about brain drains, in the West, even in say Russia or, Ireland or even Australia, where people don't have opportunities. So they head off, but they can always fly home for Christmas. and they can always come back at some point, and maybe share their wealth and opportunity with people in their homes. And it must be like this one-way kind of consideration for young, talented, educated people from Gaza and the West Bank, to lesser extent, but still there, who have to make these incredibly consequential decisions, that leave them unable to see their family, for these black spots, these, poor to define, where you don't even know when you might be able to come home. I couldn't imagine what that's like for young Palestinians. And you read about that Palestinians are per capita some of the most educated and literate people in the region. And I want to ask you is this how important is this education? Firstly, to rise above the reality that's in front of every Palestinian, but what does it also mean, further down the track, for the ambitions of Palestinians?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, education in general, it's become part of the culture, the Palestinian culture, the Arab culture in general, but most importantly, specifically the Palestinian. It becomes almost a stigma if someone drops out of school and, pursue arts or sports or anything else other than, you know, um, educational degree where you actually get a job or you pursue higher education if possible. I was one of the lucky ones that I was given the opportunity to leave. And it's interesting. I wanted to pick on a point that you mentioned. That sacrifice that Palestinians usually give to be able to leave their country, leave their families, and pursue higher education and jobs and support their families from overseas. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had this neo-Nazi march and rallies on the streets demanding those brand people and refugees and Arabs to leave and go back to where they are from. I mean, my response would be, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be away from my family. If it wasn't for your government, for your government's actions to enable that system of oppression that actually pushed me out in the first place. So I would like to be with my family. My niece and nephews, they're growing up away from their uncle, and my brothers and sisters, they're growing old without me living on my own here. So I don't want to be here, and so this is a convoluted way to answer your question, but it becomes so important, so crucial for us to pursue education, specifically because we are under occupation, we are under expansive colonization, and we understand that our main weapon is education and is science and is combating this trivial propaganda and Haspera machine that the colonizers continue to engage in. So yes, in a nutshell, it's really crucial for Palestinians, other than any nationalities around, I think.
And I think one thing that's not really spoken about as much as the toll that we've seen on hospitals and things like that, are just the absolute devastation on schools and universities, places of learning. It's almost like there's a form of enmity that's attached to wanting to wipe out that wisdom, that collective wisdom of Palestinians. And
100%.
and in
Yeah.
Gaza City right now, we're seeing this ancient city. And maybe you can sort of let us know a little bit about Gaza City and how old it is and how important it is. But these even the history of Palestine now is being wiped off the face of the earth in Gaza City. And I'll just like to, ask you a little bit about what this current stanza in Gaza City, which seems to be the most significant undertaking by the IDF in a while, what that actually means right now for the education, for the history, but also for the fate of Gaza.
It's absolutely devastating. We still are in the middle of it, unfortunately, and I don't know where we're going out of this genocide. But like you said, it's a systemic destruction of the educational system, systemic destruction of the healthcare system, of the art system, the galleries, the museums, the heritage sites. It's a destruction of life in Gaza. Life, past, present, and future, is what they're attempting. And so it becomes crucial on us living in a diaspora to actually focus on where we are and what we do, and really center every single thing we do in our life around the future of Gaza and Palestine. This becomes incumbent on every single one. We can't just say, I don't care about what's happening now and continue about my life as a Palestinian or as an Arab. We have this obligation to have Palestine as a focus into the future, because those school students who have not been to school for about 2 years now, 2 years not being able to go to school to learn anything, those nurses, those engineers, those scientists, those artists, those authors, we have plenty of them. We still have books being authored out of Gaza right now, stories, poems, reflections, articles describing what's happening. Those journalists that are putting their lives, sacrificing their lives so that we know and we understand what's happening on Gaza is going through. So it's devastating. It's painful to see that systemic destruction, but it's our duty to actually portray that to the world and to expose that system of oppression, that system of criminality that the Palestinians continue to be subjected to. And you compared our moment to a Nakba. This is exactly what happened. A lot of the educational system, the infrastructure, the education infrastructure, the social infrastructure had been destroyed in a Nakba 1948. And people lost their lives, their livelihoods, and it's beyond restoration, unfortunately, back then. But now this moment kind of revives that hope that restoring that life may be possible. Some people believe that, amid the frustration, the hopelessness. I think we need to continue hoping that life in Gaza can be restored, can be rebuilt, and we need to develop ourselves for that end goal.
When you spoke about that education and the pragmatism that comes with it, the logic, the science, often at odds with like Bronze Age biblical geopolitics that you're dealing with on the other side. And it creates like it's more than just the flame. It's kind of like a foundation stone, something like that, because you can't erode something that's logical, that follows a method. And that's a method that people are increasingly beginning to understand, across the world. And we will get to the recognition of Palestine and what that might mean, in the long term, and also seeing some big shifts with, groups of actors and, in the mainstream, these messages, coming through a little bit more. But I would like to, speak to you a little bit about the other side before we move on, and about the costs of the genocide. We're seeing the costs of the genocide every day on our live feeds in Gaza and what it's doing to the people there. With that report of 680 plus thousand dead, which is another report out there. It's just incredibly mind-blowing. But the Western media, hardly touches on the dynamics of that, and maybe sometimes just throws it into a bit of a blob, especially in Australia. But another element here that I think is even less reported on is the stability of Israeli society carrying out such an act. And, I often, wonder myself, and I think a lot of people do, about the cost of the genocide itself. And not just the economic costs, but the spiritual costs of waging such a brutal and kind of, you can't really compare it to anything in the modern era. Like we're seeing things, just those economic wheels turning, like lack of investment, and you spoke about a brain drain in Gaza, but the Israeli brain drain is real. People are talking about that. We've got massive protests. Haaretz are writing more scathing articles about the society than the Age or the Sydney Morning Herald or the ABC for that matter. So, what is the impact of all of this on the state of Israel? And is there a potential risk to the viability of the future viability of the state waging this genocide?
This is a very interesting question, and it really needs to be delved into really much deeper than what it's been talked about in the mainstream media and the social media. Because going back to the origins of the Israeli society and how it formed off the back of this ideology that has proven itself to be criminal, to say the least, patching all these segments of different communities and societies around the world together in that manner and bringing them, some from Yemen, some from Russia, some from Denmark, some from Poland, some from Germany, some from Egypt, completely different, have absolutely nothing to do with each other, have absolutely no relations. And, they're coming up with this society. And that's why these reasons has always been divided. What the Al-Aqsa flood did is actually exposed that division. And the already existing division, because the demonstrations against Netanyahu and the recent legislation in Israel has been going on for years, not just after the genocide. What the genocide did, what October the 7th did, is manifested that, or clearly brought that to the fore. So these divisions between the community already existing, that reflects on the politics of that society, and it's been brewing under the surface for years and decades and decades. And now it's showing. Add to that certain divisions as well when it comes to religion. You have this messianic society communities in Israel. You have this religious communities. You have this, Zionist, but a bit liberal Zionist community. So that added more divisions in already existing divisions, and that also surfaces politically. And this is how we're seeing the protests intensifying. We're seeing some soldiers, going into Gaza, committing genocide, and going through this extravaganza brainwashing machine. Some of them come back and, sit with themselves for a couple of days. They end up committing suicide because
Yeah.
they can't live with the fact that they were actually, you know, uh, been brainwashed into committing these atrocities, into filming yourself uh, killing babies in incubators. It's unbearable. It's like talking about how to become a Nazi, really, in Nazi Germany in 1930s. This is happening in front of us, live streamed, as we see, the genocide intensifying. And so, yes, there's an economic pressure on Israel externally. Yes, there is some sort of division happening inside the society, and that all contributes. But my argument is the only reason Israel has been sustained for the past 2 years, there are two reasons. The main one, of course, everyone knows, is the blind support that they get from the US administration, the almost 14 billions that they get every year. But another thing that is also crucial is the defense force, the Israeli defense force that they've helped build ever since the 1967. Exporting these systems of surveillance, systems of oppression and death, really, to the world. So the defense industry is also contributing to the maintenance and sustenance of this society.
Mm.
And that, Anthony Lowenstein wrote about that in his book. And that was clear in the recent and Francesca Albanese's report, how, all these weapons manufacturers, Lockheed Martins of the world, the Palantirs of the world, continue to contribute to the thriving defense industry in Israel. Although there's an economic pressure, although there's social division, but I think the main contributors of sustaining Israel and this genocidal regime are these two. And until these two are, mitigated or impacted or eliminated, we will unfortunately continue to see the genocide thriving in Israel.
So much of it seems to be running on steam, Ahmed. And you know, like the memories and the ghosts of something that came before as well. I mean, in Israeli society, there's so much of a disconnect between that kind of legacy Israel and the post October 7 Israel. And as you mentioned, you know, all these little like squashed together elements of Israeli societies, you know, a little bit here from Soviet Russia, a little bit here from North Africa, a little bit here from Iraq, and everything sort of gets pushed in. And yeah, a lot of people are propelling themselves on the myth or huffing that fart of Israeli society every day. But now, as the genocide and I suppose the troops are coming back, the domestic violence rates are going up, you know, the self harm, and we're seeing like a, you know, I often wonder, you know, professional armies was the whole point of them, not just to, you know, make more efficient killing machines, but also to stop bands of people from going around and having the psychological trauma of just being in these kind of rape killing gangs. You know, professional armies were about giving people a passage to sleep at night and to be able to be sort of professional soldiers that could sort of rest their laurels, go down to the pub when they retire and say, you know, I did something right out there. But it's impossible to do that with this Israeli Defense Force right now. And what they're expecting these young people to carry forward, you can argue the crimes they're committing are worse than the Nakba, than their forefathers, the people that created Israel committed. And they're coming back to a society that doesn't really care about them, run by a man that's pushing them somewhere for his own political survival. So I'd like to also speak about that, about the configuration of the IDF. But right now, Israel is at war with 7 surrounding nations. We're seeing a lot going on here, and you know, I want to point towards the Pakistan-Saudi Defense Pact, which was a, you know, pretty huge statement. Egypt making a couple of, you know, calls a little bit more belligerent towards Israel than it has in the past. Even Turkey getting involved. But via that, I just sort of want to ask, you know, does the glorified apartheid police force, that is the IDF, with some air support, is that the army that's going to be able to win this incredibly like overextended fight that they're in right now? Or are they completely dependent on trapping the US into some regional war with Iran to survive?
I think ideologically speaking and psychologically and mentally speaking, they have been going through this systematic regime of indoctrination through the IDF. You know, you have French Jews coming from France, going through that system, Zionizing their brains, for the lack of a better word, into believing in their own supremacy, into their own primacy over the others, over the Arabs in general, because Palestinians for the Israelis are not Palestinians, they're Arabs. They never refer to us as Palestinians because that's an acknowledgement that we exist or Palestine exists. And so that level of superiority actually prepared the IDF soldiers or the IOF soldiers to actually adopt that that kind of thinking and that understanding of othering the Arabs. And therefore, it was so entrenched and so deep that we are not seen as human. And when Yoav Gallant, the defense minister in 2023, the Israeli defense minister, said that we're dealing with subhuman, that's not just a passing statement. That concept is adopted by the majority of the Jewish Israeli society, because they don't see us as human, and the level of propaganda and haspara that came out of October the 7th gave them the perfect alibi to go in and just go nuts and do whatever they want, or whatever they can imagine be done to any other animal or subhuman. And so psychologically, they have been prepared through that system of Zionization of the Jewish mentalities into committing these crimes, heinous crimes, that have been compared inside the Israeli society by the Nazis recently. Economically and militarily, of course, they are heavily supported and maintained and sustained by external support from the US. And so being engaged with 7 Arab countries, I can't see them winning, to be honest, because like I said, that external support is not going to be permanent. There are other levers that we in the West, for example, can work on and pressure that we can exert in order to limit that level of support. And eventually, I think that the IOF is going to find itself isolated, not able to continue, and embarrassed in the international fora. I think the Iran hoax will come back. I think Israel will not stop until they re-agitate the whole area. I think Netanyahu and Israel understands that Israel is going through a very, very, probably the most critical point of its time, and that upcoming period is going to be really, really dangerous, because that's when usually those self-acclaimed superpowers, I mean, Israel is the superpower in the Arab world, in I don't want to call it Middle East, I hate that label, but it is the superpower of that region at the moment. And when a superpower really realizes that it's approaching its end time, there's a huge threat against its existential threat, then it's going to be incredibly aggressive and barbaric, and we see that happening. So I join Ilan Papi in saying that we are witnessing almost the end of this barbaric, unholy state of Israel, and an end of this supremacist ideology of Zionism.
Yeah, well, let's save for the Samson protocol, which we could maybe talk about a little bit further in this next question, because when I look at a lot of geopolitical flashpoints, if you're looking at, say, the China-US great power competition, you can see, the realist, the ideological, and the power considerations that are going into their rivalry right there. But with the way Israel's engaging with the region, it's not a conventional conflict. The way they're perceiving their foes, the way they're striking out at them. And we've had former heads of Shin Bet. We've got generals ringing alarm bells. I think there was a letter signed by a bunch of top-ranking military officials warning against the occupation of Gaza City and further occupation of Gaza. There seems to be, even the moderate parliamentarians in Israel, conjure around this language. We heard Amalek coming out of Netanyahu's mouth. And as anyone that's from a monotheistic religion, you can harken back to that those passages and see exactly what that means. I wanted to ask you a little bit, like, when you look at things as a pragmatic, realist, geopolitical analyst, it doesn't make sense. But when you start looking through Israel's objectives through a religious lens, through the messianic, the geopolitics of messianic Israel, of greater Israel, you can see other things at play. Now, look, I just wanted to ask you if there is an element of this religious, biblical prophecy driving Israel's geopolitics and geostrategy at the moment in the region.
I can say yes to a very, very large extent. And we can see that clearly recently with the statements coming out of Smotrich and Ben Gvir and Netanyahu even. But deeper in the society, I think the Israeli society has been moving towards that conceptual understanding of what their existence is about in that region, and that's definitely ascribed to the nature of Zionism, brainwashing and hijacking Judaism into believing in old biblical stories and projecting that on the ground, on the reality, which is an egregious thing to do, considering the Old Testament as a historical record and a prophecy that needs to be accomplished at some point. That's the gist of Zionism. That's the gist of restorationism, really. Ever since the Reformation and the Martin Luther's writings and the Protestants, all the way to the Christian Zionism and the current Trump administration. So they're emboldened by the most powerful superpower in the world right now to actually implement what they've been preaching in that society for years and decades into, the return of the Jews to the Holy Land, the bringing back the Messiah, and the expansion. So I've been asked this a while back, and I really believe that now, by and large, the majority of the Jewish Israeli society believe that they're fighting a war of liberation of some sort, against the Amaleks you mentioned, and against the barbarians. And that feeds into the textbook definition of settler colonialism, because in every single settler colonial experience around the world, you look at the Northern America, you look at the Algeria, you look at South Africa, you look at this continent here, there has always been a religious pretext and alibi that we are the superior race. We are here, elected by divine intervention, selected to conquer this land and civilize it, because this land is a terra nullius, or a land without a people for a people without a land. So there's always this religious cover to justify. And then when you go and commit a genocide, when you go and exterminate the First Nations of this land, you do that without, having any pain in your conscience that you're entitled to be doing that because you're supreme. You have this supremacist, white supremacist ideology that pushes you to do it with a very comfortable conscience. And so it's unfortunate that, yes, this has what the Zionist movement been about ever since its inception. Zionism, before the World War I, for example, or before the establishment of Israel, Ilan Pappé speaks about that. Zionism is no longer this benevolent, emotion, yearning emotion to be around the Holy Land. It's not anymore this religious aspiration to be in the vicinity of the near the biblical stories and what happened. It's not that national aspiration to be one nation and to protect ourselves from anti-Semitism and persecution in Europe and so on and so forth. Zionism has leveraged these Protestant anti-Semitic tropes and anti-Semitic definitions of what it means to be a Jew. It leveraged all that hate, all that persecution, all that trauma, and also leveraged the religious, racist interpretation of the Bible, of the Old Testament, into indoctrinating the society and the Jewish people around the world into believing in its ideology and mobilizing to support this really, like I said, unholy rogue state. And so I lost track of the question, but I hope that answers the question in some way.
Definitely. And, like Manifest Destiny in the United States and Terra Nullius in Australia, there are similarities within the general kind of colonial genocidal outlook, that veranda anthropology that kind of allowed people to sort of sit back and have a sip of their tea at the end of the day. But added to this is this kind of chosen people, the people of Israel, the 12 tribes. And I wouldn't mind, this is a tricky topic, but there has been these religious elements kind of ever present. Even the delineations of Greater Israel, which we're seeing on some of the patches on the arms of some of the soldiers. And we just heard today or yesterday, Israel announced that they are permanently seizing Mount Hermon. Now, it seen as a strategic location, but it's also a place where Nephilim landed. And, there's reports that there are rabbis there, like Indiana Jones type rabbis running around looking for archaeology digs and things like that. We've heard of the red heifers, the genetically modified cows, that one of which was sacrificed the other week in, I don't know if it was a simulation or something like that. And then there's the whole messianic industry in Israel, which is really buffeted and probably wouldn't be able to be as powerful and potent as it is without the Christian Zionism via the Schofield Bible references that have essentially changed the whole mechanics of the return of Jesus Christ and put Israel and Israel's primacy before that. So I'd just like to, ask you if you see some of these things at play here, that there are now mainstream aspects of these kind of like really Bronze Age biblical, and they're so exclusive to Jews and Israeli people only, to restore the Temple Mount. We're hearing things about, demolishing Alaska Mosque. And we also saw in the letter written by Hamas about the reason for Alaska flood. And one of the reasons of Alaska flood itself was based around their worries that Alaska is going to be destroyed. And I think red heifers were mentioned in that as well. So where does this come into play on both sides? I mean, the interpretation of Hamas, but also the wider interpretation of Israeli society. Is it just something they're pinning their colors to in desperation, or is there something here that's driving them forward? It's more conviction.
Look, absolutely. Like I said, the Israelis think they're fighting a war of liberation, and a religious war of liberation, that is. And therefore, they see the revival of their Jewish kingdom, which extends from the Euphrates to the Nile. And that's what they perceive their remit of control should be. And the entire region will be submitting to their kingdom and their ruling. That includes large swaths of Arab land, almost the majority of Jordan, the majority of Syria, the southern parts of Lebanon, and so on and so forth. And even when the troops were trying to progress into the southern Lebanon part, they were also having, as part of the soldiers, some archaeologists actually digging for evidence to prove that this is a Jewish land. And until now, nothing materialized, because it's just wrong to start with reflecting the biblical stories into and using it as a historical record. And so, absolutely, I mean, the current society, by and large, the current Israeli society, they consider themselves the religious heirs to this area, and seek that end goal by military, and they have been deeply supported by evangelical Christians in the Trump administration, which has been the most supportive administration to this state. And I personally, I 100% agree that the main drive that the current American administration is using to support the state of Israel is purely religious, purely based on biblical stories, the evangelical Christians, the Christian Zionists, the Mark Huckabee of the world. The other day he showed up to a press conference with a cross on his forehead. It's ridiculous to see the level of indoctrination, the level of belief, and flagrant expression of religious beliefs, and the support of the killing and the extermination of babies and civilians and women and children. It's just unbelievable.
And seeing these, representatives and senators, baying for Israel to continue this kind of this action, people like Lindsey Graham, these lifelong kind of Republicans, but people like Chuck Schumer, these lifelong Democrats. And I think we kind of forget sometimes just how encapsulated the bipartisan, especially in the Anglosphere, the bipartisan political system is. And we see it here in Australia. We mentioned the importance of Christian Zionism. With the numbers sort of going, and, where we saw over 60% of Gen Z support in the US support Hamas over the IDF, and we have more than half of the American population support against Israel for the first time in since the state was created. And yeah, contrasting this against Huckabee, that bloke, and Rubio, who's probably made half a dozen visits in 6 months to Israel, and that 250 representatives and senators in Jerusalem the other day under the 50 states, one Israel. Did you see that at all?
No, not really. Yeah.
It's the largest ever foreign delegation of American politicians in the history of America. And there were 250 representatives and senators from 50 states in Jerusalem, essentially being told how to do their job. So I want to ask you this a little bit. Has Trump essentially, Biden allowed this to happen, and Trump has kind of put it into hyperspeed. But is he also, hastening the collapse of the Israeli narrative? It's being handled with such sausage fingers,
That's a good analogy. I agree. I absolutely agree. And this becomes, I'm going to reflect on the Palestinian movement and how it's faring as well in this context. But I totally agree. I mean, one of the statistics that you mentioned is that, the youth in Republican voters as well are increasingly opposing Israel, from, I think it was from the 20s or 30%, all the way into 50% of Trump's voters pretty much are refusing to continue to support Israel. So that's a huge shift in the public opinion. And this is currently my focus on the public opinion in terms of opposing the genocide and lobbying for the dismantlement of apartheid Israel, is working on the public opinion, because it is working. I mean, those youth, Republican, evangelical Christians, or whatever they are, when they see the reels on their Instagrams and TikToks, they just refuse to follow the original rationale and to follow what Trump is feeding in their minds, increasingly so. And this is really something that we need to be hopeful and positive about. I think Trump is blindly supporting the narrative that comes out of the Christian Zionist lobby. Now, the difference between Trump and Biden was pressured and acquiesced with the pressure from the AIPAC. So the AIPAC is not largely infiltrated by these messianic religious evangelical Christians, but more of, liberal Zionists/Zionists, whereas Trump is blindly following what Rubio is telling him, what Lindsey Graham is telling him, what Hagee is telling him. And all what they are telling him, all what they're feeding into his brain, and the narrative that comes out of his mouth, I mean, regardless, it's rubbish anyway, but it becomes more and more rubbish when you add this religious flavor to it. And this is why Trump's narrative and policies are contributing to this rebellion in his constituency, especially when it comes to the youth. And this is when it becomes really, really important for us to be careful around this not new, but really emerging, and it's trying to force itself into the political narrative, the liberal Zionists, trying to strip itself from all that religious veneer that Trump has acquiesced to, and start talking rationally about salvaging what's left of Zionism in the American psyche, rescuing Israel, if you will, from being completely destroyed and abolished by the doing of the Trump administration. And that's why we really need to be careful around these calls that say we need to end occupation, we need to enforce two-state solutions, we need to allow for the Palestinians to live. We need so all these statements are, they're hiding behind the real definition of Zionism, the definition of Zionism, which can never change. The Zionism from the start until now has always been about supremacy, racism, expansionism, and now it's evolving into this level of fascism and criminality. And therefore, any type of Zionism needs to be combated and abolished, not only to sustain an Israeli state on the borders of 1967, because eventually, because of its nature, it will seek to expand further and further, and it will seek to allow for this messianic indoctrination to prevail, and it will eventually continue this round of fighting for liberation and the greater Israel. So we really need to be as stern as we can in the Palestinian movement to advocate for the eradication of that ideology. And when I say eradication of that ideology, it's the eradication of racism and supremacy, which has led us to where we are now.
Israeli society, we spoke about it running on steam, but it kind of has to adopt this narrative now. There's a fantastic Chinese professor, Professor Jiang, and he was speaking about a Chinese military strategy with regards to Gaza. It's called the Dead River strategy, where generals traditionally in China would line their armies up, if they could, with a river behind their back. So when the army they were fighting against would push them back, there would be a point where they'd get to the river, and they would, more often than not, they would fight forward and break through rather than drown in the river. And he was comparing this strategy to Israeli society, that the river is the dead children and the unconscionable amount of crime and suffering and pain and death. And there's no way they're going to fall into that river and be surrounded by it. So they push forward into the unknown. And it's really interesting how you kind of, you're talking about the AIPAC legacy Israel, and like how they'd reached the cadence and a pace of their slow removal of the Palestinians that was kind of working in its own way with the weight of everything behind it. But it seemed like Netanyahu and the crazies pivoted very quickly, and a lot of the eggs went over into the Trump basket without that infrastructure there. So now you've got, people like Pete Hegseth reciting, Our Father who art in heaven with, jet planes and bombs going off on promotion videos. And they're trying to sort of push a new narrative together about Israel as the whole thing is just breaking apart. Like it's an incredible thing to witness. So I just want to ask you regarding Trump, we haven't spoken about his capture by the Adelsons, by, his unique relationship to the Israeli Zionism. He's been given the Torah Crown Award by the international Jewish bodies. He's been called King Cyrus and been told he's the man that's going to bring back and restore the temple and all this sort of stuff. But what's it going to take? We are at a point now where, the human wave is pushing in such a way. Even Australia, Canada, and the UK are getting on board. What's it going to take for this Trump administration to about face and put Netanyahu in the box?
Truman once said, "I am Cyrus" as well. When he was eventually forced to recognize the state of Israel. What it will take to force Trump into giving up on Israel, pretty much. I really don't see anything else but external pressure. All these countries refusing to abide by the orders of the the current empire, other than being forced into a corner to give up his support by um, emerging powers, really, around the world. You have China, you have Russia, you have new allies forming, you have the BRICS, you have Brazil, you have all these really influential economies and kind of potential superpowers into the future, um, allying together, and advocating for justice and peace and equality uh, in the world generally. And I think until that moment, Trump will continue to be enabled and controlled by these religious fanatics and zealots. I can't see any other way other than economic pressure. Trump is a businessman and he likes to make deals and he likes, um, ways of money and economy. And until the point where supporting Israel becomes more expensive and too taxing on America, I think eventually he will have to succumb to that pressure. But like I said, us as an Arab conglomerate, if you will, these alliances in the Arab world are really promising that you mentioned, to ally with other rising powers and giving up on the American hegemony in the region. I think that can eventually contribute to Trump giving up on Israel.
And potentially the rise of multipolarism, could be coming in full circle as well. There was some fascinating footage of a colonel in China getting just completely undressed, and with this kind of like Confucian pragmatism that the Chinese can apply. But with Trump and his compromise, and we talk about the Epstein stuff like it's a boogeyman. Like, we're made to feel like we can't even mention something like this that may be influencing massively the Trump administration. But could there be an element here where they're going to hold our head to the flame for another 2 and a bit years and just allow this thing to push through?
Like I mentioned, those alliances eventually will come together and try to impede these kind of ridiculous future plans for Gaza, for evacuating Gaza and creating these future cities. I think eventually, the more we work on public opinion, the more we try to really rehumanize. The other day I had a conversation with Professor John Keane, and he spoke about this cultivated indifference that our societies have been going through all these years, all these decades. And what we need to do is to just awaken the society, rehumanize them, and we do that by just exposing what Zionism is about, what Zionism is trying to do, what religious fanaticism is trying to implement, as we have been really asleep or has been cultivated to this level of indifference, that level of ignorance, where we see babies being burned and shredded alive, and we just keep scrolling through our Instagram. It's just we really need to work on the public opinion, because that's how Zionism actually promoted itself in the 20s and the 30s.
The awakening the masses thing is the thing I find a bit frustrating, even with some of my normie mates that I've grown up with. Yeah, who via the legacy media haven't been able to get enough meat and potatoes to bite into this thing, and they still sit back absent. Look, there's a blissful ignorance factor in this country I can't quite get my head around, but the fact that the legacy media has been so appalling, where if it just told a fraction of the story, and I'm talking about even the ABC here, this country would have enough to, potentially have pushed the government and the political class in a certain direction that reflects our society's wishes, potentially much earlier. And the legacy media is such an important part about informing people. And we've seen these public broadcasters in Canada, the BBC, even Al Jazeera to some extent, modify itself when reporting around this genocide and the details on the ground. So, well, firstly, how important has the legacy media been in protecting and preserving and enabling Israel's, current trajectory? And yeah, is there a gravity or an inertia or something that will kick off a whole new era of the legacy media that might impinge on these Trumps, that might impinge on Netanyahu and Israeli society?
Yeah, first of all, I mean, the Western media has been incredibly shameless in blatantly supporting the genocide, in being entrenched and complicit in enabling and promoting the genocide, in and eventually they will be held accountable, like the media's role in previous genocides in Africa and elsewhere. They will eventually be accountable, held accountable. All these journalists who are Zionists or Zionized or being indifferent or being silenced, not having the guts to come out and speak out, to dare to stand up for Gaza and against genocide. All these individuals, all these managers, all these office holders and bearers in the mainstream media will one day be held accountable legally, and history will not have mercy on them. Absolutely not. They have been disgustingly complicit. And speaking about the mainstream media also in Israel, I mean, I've been watching the Israeli media almost every day, and it's beyond disgusting. At least in the Israeli society, surprisingly so. You have some level of freedom to allow editors and journalists to actually speak out against genocide, like Gideon Levy and the likes. No, Noi Orly the other day, she's openly comparing they're doing in Gaza to the Nazis' Holocaust.
Mhm.
We can't even say the word genocide when it comes to Israel here in the ABC, or even in the ABC or the BBC. So it's just mind-boggling.
I have to beep it out of this YouTube video in order not to get, suppressed by, online. It's just incredible. Yeah, in the West. And when you see the compartmentalization of TikTok under Larry Ellison, a big Zionist, you're going, wow, they're just corralling everyone into these bubbles and throwing shit at people that they already know is bullcrap, and they're not going to be turned. It's incredible to see them stacking up like this. And then the legislation via Washington, and the legislation that we've seen here in the state and federal parliaments of our country. All the threads are bending around this like Israeli sort of foreign object that's just changed our whole society so drastically.
When you have someone from the Jewish Board of Deputies on the board of SBS, when you have a former board member of Lockheed Martin on the board of SBS right now, what do you expect of these kind of news channels? Would you expect them to be talking openly about the genocide when they have, someone in their midst controlling the narrative, only focusing on the humanitarian crisis and the famine in Gaza, and not even mentioning who's causing it? So it's absolutely shameless that weapons manufacturers and weapons industry have installed itself in the middle of all those mainstream media, educational, universities, in the middle of those establishments, in order to control the narrative and silence any criticism, any criticism of the state of Israel, and calling it as an anti-Semite, talking about the envoy for anti-Semitism. And I've mentioned that a number of times, and I don't know if you want to have it on your platform, but you know, I criticize my friend for showing up late for a coffee catch up. I criticize, a restaurant for giving my meal a bit late or putting too much salt. I'm not criticizing Israel. I'm calling for the dismantlement of this regime that is so criminal, that there's, like you said, 96 of the Israeli society is saying that what the IOF is doing in Gaza is not enough, or it is enough,
Yeah.
enough violence. When you have 80 or 60, 65% saying that we need to apply, that biblical story of the exterminating the Gazans, the likes of what we did with the Amaleks. I mean, I always say, forget about the genocide, right? Forget about the killing of babies. Forget about the destruction of healthcare system, education, schools. Forget about the famine. Forget about everything. When you see that society that produced these kind of human or subhuman that are proudly filming themselves killing babies in incubators, are we going to be okay with that society thriving into the future?
Right.
Like, this is not criticism. We can't talk about criticism anymore. I really want to touch on a point that you mentioned. Where is it going to end? When is the whole thing is going to end? And, talking about the dehumanizing of the brains in the Israeli society. Like, when this is all done and dusted and over, the genocide is ending, the trauma is not only for the Palestinians in Gaza or the West Bank. The trauma is in those brains that were Zionized to commit all these atrocities, to come to peace with their crimes, to be able to repent. It's going to be a huge psychological and mental toll on them. Maybe it's probably weird for me to talk about this, as a Palestinian, as being the one who's on the side of receiving the atrocities and oppression, but eventually it'll be very difficult for both citizens to come to peace with what happened and attempt to live together. And I think to get to that end, I agree, BDS is probably one of the most important and effective ways that we can pressure ahead in order to dismantle this system of injustice and inequality. The reason why we were able to sustain our movement here in the West and the diaspora against Israel and against the genocide for 2 years, for this long, the main reason is, to me at least, is the Palestinian armed resistance on the ground. If that has collapsed in the first 3 months, we wouldn't be here. And it's just absolutely miraculous that they are able to hold their ground, to sustain themselves, to inflict damage and casualties on the invading Israeli occupation army, and to be able to support themselves all that long. And when you look at the casualties, when you look at the testimonies of the doctors coming out of Gaza, they're saying all we see is dead children and women and civilians. We don't see dead militants, and that's testament to our resistance, to our armed resistance. And in order to support that, it's a major factor in combating apartheid Israel in this genocidal, unholy state. But on top of that, also externally, as Palestinians in diaspora, as citizens of the world, our duty is to educate the public and try to change the public opinion, to public perception of what Israel is, what Zionism is, as opposed to being Jewish, especially inside the Jewish community. So education is key. Also, BDS you mentioned is one of the most important things because it's all about economy. Citing Clinton's election campaign motto, it's the economy is stupid. So it's all about the economy. It's all about money. So exacting all that economic pressure on Israel, I think it's really important to first to stop the genocide. Picketing outside weapons manufacturers to picket outside politicians in order to pressure them to take political stance, diplomatic stance, other than this perfunctorily just recognizing the state of Israel, which means nothing. Probably we'll get to this later on. Dismantling that system, not only occupation of the expansion of settlements, to facilitate the right of return. More importantly, that's one of the main goals or the principles of BDS, upholding the right of return, equal rights, justice, the end of expansion of settlements, the end of occupation. Eventually, this is how we achieve, justice for everyone from the river to the sea, and we achieve, a free Palestine. That's actually what it means to allow for the dismantlement of this apartheid regime, and beyond that, the abolishment, the eradication, like I said, of this supremacist ideology that is really impeding the achievement of justice and equality for everyone. And talking about the recognition, I don't know if you want to get into it or not. It's unbelievable that all these years the countries recognize that Israelis are human. Israelis are worthy of sovereignty, worthy of right, worthy of justice, worthy of all these things that any human being should be endowed to, but opposing it for the Palestinians. And now that Palestinians are being exterminated, they're providing this, empty statement of recognition. So it's absolutely shameful.
They would like to say in Canberra, I would love to, behind closed doors, they'd be like, oh, we had to make such a big call. You don't know how much work we've put in. We've been stuck between a rock and a hard place. And this is a very consequential decision for Australia. And the repercussions from Washington could be blah, 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 blah. But that said, they've recognized a member party platform a few years late from the party conference. That's about all they've done. And they've also done it in concert with their little Anglosphere mates, one of whom provides spy plane missions over Gaza to conduct genocide, and also refuels extrajudicial attacks in Qatar, things like that. So we're seeing, the same thing happening with us with our F-35 parts, with heat-treated steel plate and things like that. And, probably more importantly, just the normalcy, the diplomatic, economic, and to some extent military normalcy that Australia maintains. Australia keeps saying that we can't do much, and we can't say much from afar. But as a middle power in this interesting exotic place on Earth, traditionally Australia has had a very big kind of presence diplomatically as a middle power when it's made calls around human rights or around upholding international law. And is this a big watershed moment, or is it just symbolic? And how much does it actually mean when we don't have, when we still maintain that normalcy? For example, maintaining diplomats.
Yeah, I mean, because of all what you mentioned, it's laughable. It really is laughable that it comes at this juncture. That now you recognize that Palestine. What does that mean? Without acknowledging the Palestinian suffering. You're acknowledging a state of Palestine, but the Palestinians are being genocided right now. You're not even recognizing that there is a genocide happening in Gaza. You're resisting admitting that there is a genocide in Gaza in order to avoid your obligations under international law, in order to evade the fact that you have been complicit directly and indirectly in feeding that genocide and in the genociding of the Palestinians that you've just recognized. So what does it mean if you recognize a country, if you recognize a people, while not even behind the scenes, openly, sending non-lethal weapon parts, as it's just laughable, non-lethal weapon parts. You continue to finance, you continue to provide diplomatic support, you continue to send weapon parts to this genocidal state. You continue to go and pay them visits as a foreign minister, and all the while you come and recognize Palestine. It doesn't mean anything, you know. Um, Also, something that everyone should know, that while also continuing to allow for Australians to enlist in the IOF and commit that genocide against the Palestinians.
It's a slap in the face, right? I mean, like, and it feels like a bit of red meat to the rusted on kind of centrist lefties under Labor. And same with the Carney government and the Starmer government. No coincidence that they're all center left parties that are trying to sort of appease things. But the public is so focused right now on this issue on both sides. And, you know, the majority of the public is wanting a little bit more than that. So how long, I mean, they might think this is a band-aid. I mean, some might be thinking it might be enough so they can push it to the side and just allow this genocide to carry out and this, you know, complete ethnic cleansing. So do you think that there is a little bit more at play? You know, I mean, Albanese had this, you know, thing where he was the parliamentary Friends of Palestine bloke and he was at a few rallies. So maybe in his heart of hearts, there could be a sympathy there, you know, for Palestine and maybe a will to want more. Do you think that anything more is going to come out of this summit, or?
I don't think there's an iota of sympathy in this bastard's heart, really. I absolutely don't think at all. And I don't think that the majority of the Palestinians will buy into this rhetoric. It's nothing but a fig leaf to hide the complicity of this country in genocide. It's nothing but a fig leaf to evade its obligations under international law and ICJ and UN resolutions. What we need is to recognize the suffering of the Palestinians and do everything we can to stop the genocide, everything we can to hold those Australian soldiers accountable for what they did and what they're about to do in Gaza. You know, it's not about the hostages. He always mentions the hostages, the Israeli hostages. What about the tens of thousands of Palestinian hostages that continue to be taken from homes in the West Bank, in Gaza, and be, you know, subjected to the most brutal systems of torturing and systematic, you know, killing, and, you know, talking about killing in prisons and in custody. We recognized in this colony the sovereignty of the First Nation people here. What did we do? We continue to exploit the land. We continue to incarcerate Black people. We continue to kill children in incarceration. So that perfunctory statement is incredibly similar and very hypocritical to the Palestinians and the First Nation. If it is anything, it's an insult to every Palestinian who lives on this land here and every First Nation as well. You know, talking about the common values between the colonizers and the imperial. Yes, these are the values that Albanese usually speaks about. You know, values of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid, and criminality. And so it really is an affront and an affront to the intelligence of every Palestinian person to believe in this complete, utter insanity that's coming out of this crime minister that I usually refer to him as.
I had a conversation with someone, you know, about, you know, how much worse this could have been under Morrison. You know, we're seeing him over in the US as like some wannabe evangelical, you know, reverend character. He's making some money doing a whole bunch of stuff over there. But I kind of sort of pushed back a little bit and went, you know, it might have been a little bit better if the wheels were completely off, you know, and we could see what we were actually dealing with here instead of these like passive aggressive kind of like abusive partners that pretend to be these kind of like, you know, the progressive partner of choice. And they make it out always, you know, Penny Wong is the embodiment of this message. Like, you don't understand how hard it is. You don't understand how much juggling we've got to do with the international community. And you think it's so easy. It's enraging because you point back to this terra nullius. We committed the most successful genocide in colonial history. And we joined Canada, another country that did something similar. We did something. We joined up with America, and this is like the Five Eyes countries that are binding up together here are all delivering the same message ultimately, which is like we support this genocidal project in Israel with all its laboratories, with all its kind of avant-garde new technologies.
Recognition is not going to do anything. If anything, it's just going to blur the vision for Palestinians, for the Palestinian movement. Some might subscribe to that fact. I encourage everyone not to heed, that sentiment, because that sentiment, like you mentioned, is nothing but just also like a colonial, really patronizing sentiment. Coming from a Western, reflecting this Western superiority, especially when you condition the recognition, saying a demilitarized Palestine, or if we recognize you, but you need to hold election and do something properly, or we recognize Palestine that does not include a Hamas into the future. It's something that really agitates me, even in our movement. Joel, like when you see people saying, "Oh, I advocate for one secular state," like, first of all, excuse my French, who the fuck are you, right, to dictate what that future state should look like, right? Like, you're talking about a society, a community that is right in the middle of the Islamic Arab world. You can't project your own values on that region. That's a colonial patronization. I mean,
Look, I just point those people back. Gaddafi getting dragged through the streets, getting raped by a sword in a culvert.
yeah,
That was meant. Libya is meant to be that place now, isn't it? That democratic option. The open air slave market. The boat has fucking sailed. When we talk about releasing those hostages, well, they killed orders of magnitude more hostages in the hours after Charlie Kirk's death than there are hostages remaining in Israel.
100%, 100%. I mean, who are you to speak on behalf of the Palestinians and say what they need to do? The Hamas or Islamic Jihad or Muslim parties that will always be part of Palestinian future polity. End of conversation. Otherwise, the government will be imposed on the Palestinians, and that's a colonial logic. I mean, we did an election in 2005 and 6, and Hamas won in a landslide. That's what the Palestinians wanted. And there was an orchestrated coup against the government, the elected government, to install the PA dictatorship in Gaza, by the CIA and Israel. And it failed by a preemptive coup by Hamas in 2006 and 7. And so it's been tried before. You can't force your own way. Even you claim that you're on the left side of politics here and you pro-Palestine, you just don't have a say in the future of Palestine. End of conversation.
Totally, mate.
You're an ally, you support the Palestinian leadership, and that's where you should stand. And that's where you should stay.
And I just wanted to close on a bit more of a broader, more of an emotional kind of thing, I suppose. But the Palestinian people themselves have been the butt of violence, of scorn, of enmity, in Gaza and the West Bank, but in Gaza more particularly. You've seen like the global media, to some extent, even like subjective NGOs, public broadcasters, public figures, people cherry picking things, people playing both sides, to your people, to the people of Gaza. Every day, like, you guys are being squeezed. You're like a diamond, but being squeezed by the weight of all this Hasbara, by all this misinformation, by these billion-dollar multinational legacy organizations and companies that seek to crush Palestinians, their narrative, their identity, their future. Probably the most concentrated enmity towards a people that we've experienced in the modern age, only amplified and made more apparent by the media, the social media, the noise. Um, but that said, still there's this human thread, like this sort of beautiful like flame that burns within people like yourself, mate, who have an infectious fire in your eyes. That when you speak to people, that captures. It's been a riveting conversation here. I would like to ask you, how does it feel being like that, and how does the average Palestinian grapple with this form of enmity, and how do you feel where does it come from? And how does it feel trying to understand or make sense of why the organized kind of Western world is totally against you and your survival and your need to be recognized?
It's really difficult and it's overwhelming at times, Joel, to come to peace with the understanding that I will always be seen as the other in the West. I can never be accepted as part of this society because I probably, when I meet someone, I don't pass as an Arab, but when the conversation gets to the point what's your name or where you're from, the whole thing flips around, and then the tone changes and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, we have to live with that. Yesterday we had an event, and I really had some sort of a confession to make. Like every single day ever since the genocide started, I've been questioning that decision, why I came here, like why did I pursue that, being away from family and going through all that trouble to live in this country that will never accept me as a same, and it unfortunately it feeds into so many decades and years of racism and Orientalism, against the Arab, the barbaric, the backwardly, the uncivilized. And being a Palestinian, that adds just more weight to it, and being a Muslim as well adds more and more and more weight. And so it becomes unbearable at times, facing up to this level of propaganda that the Zionists are propagating in the streets, not feeling safe, not feeling comfortable around, rallies that are saying free Palestine, justice for all, equality, all these values that we hold dear, or I thought we hold dear here in the West. And I got to admit, it's really difficult, and I'm finding day in and day out that we've been living in some sort of a mirage of a democracy and freedom and liberation. Especially when I learn more and more about the prosecution and the oppression of the First Nation people here and the brown people, and discrimination and racism against the blacks, and the incarceration and the genocide that took place more than 230 years ago. It's mind-boggling, that this society, it's I kind of understand. I kind of understand why I am being discriminated against, because it's part of the DNA of the Western white society to develop in that way, generations after generations, to have that supremacist look at others. But like I said, my purpose is to really reignite humanity in people, rehumanize the psyche of the Western society, just to bring them back to square one, where values of equality and justice and freedom are colorblind, where justice, equality, and freedom do not pay attention to religion or identity or background. We're all human, and we all deserve to be equal in on this colony or elsewhere in Palestine. And it's been difficult. Unfortunately, it's been difficult. As a Palestinian, as a person whose family is currently enduring the brunt of a full-blown Holocaust in Gaza, sometimes it gets really, really heavy. And but I find solace, and I kind of a way to vent out all that anger and emotion in activism, in talking to people, in rationalizing with them, in holding events and film screenings and educational awareness raising panels. It's really important because, going back to your first question, as a Palestinian, education is really key. It's part of my DNA, part of my culture. And I believe that the more we talk about Palestine, the more we talk about rehumanizing Palestinians, people will eventually veer back to their origin, their human origin.
It's so interesting that you harken back to the education here, and I think, as our empires become more callous and closer to their detriment, it's the education that quite often flies out the window. So contrast these educated people living on the edge of survival against these dumb, ignorant people living at the edge of a sword, trying to kind of, quell anything that threatens it. It's an incredible thing, and I think more often than not now, Ahmed, your spirit and your message is being heard in a country with a majority of people in it that support it. And I certainly do, and I think many that come across you see you not just as an other from Palestine. We see you as someone special, as someone who represents humanity right now, and it's a really important thing that people like you are speaking to people out there in Australia, because we do have a history here, a genocidal, horrible history. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you so much for being here and sharing your insight, which is, it's profound to hear.
Look, I'm incredibly, overwhelmingly grateful to your invitation to speak on your platform. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I would love to be back and talk more about other things. It's important for, you know, every Australian, not just to read an article on the Guardians, not just to read or watch a reel on their Instagram, just to speak to a Palestinian, get their first-hand opinion and first-hand narrative and experience living in Palestine. And this is what you are trying to do. So I really, really thank you for that.
Thank you for joining us, Ahmed.
Thanks, Joel.